In Texas, they have an expression that shows up pretty often, and that is that somebody looks like that they've been rode hard and put up wet. This, of course, comes from one of those horse metaphors, but sometimes we feel that way, don't we? I certainly am feeling that these days, and yet, incredibly, it seems that when you get to that place, oftentimes you feel the ministry of the Spirit that gives you just what you need in that moment, that sense of hope. I'm going to tell a story to begin with this morning that many of you have heard before, and it's okay. Think about how many times my wife has listened to my stories. I begin by saying I'm starting another series of sermons that will take us into February. It is kind of focused the umbrella on territory that I've covered before, but I want to get into a little more detail and with some more specifics as we go along. But today, it's about that umbrella. If you're going to have a vision, you have to go looking for it. It was the 1950s when the church that my friend has pastored for so many years, he wasn't pastor then, made a momentous decision. I can't let Epiphany season go by without remembering the story because it is such a great story. None of the churches in the metropolitan Atlanta area were showing any willingness to be Christian and integrate. This Baptist church that had benefited so greatly from the post-war boom had a pastor who could no longer tolerate the church being less than the church. And so he began that discussion about the need for Oakhurst to stand up, to make a stand. And consequently, that brought him to a vote. Actually, it's interesting because he resides not that far north of here, somewhere between Ormond Beach and New Smyrna Beach, up in that area, where he has been retired for a long time. With one vote, Oakhurst Baptist Church in Decatur, Georgia, lost 49% of its members. They'd built a new education building. In the midst of the crisis, they rented it out to Southern Bell and continued their ministry in the old building where they still reside, though it's been renovated a couple of times since. That marked that church. It marked that church because in a moment of crisis, they considered something more than money. They considered something more than a few people or many people. They only considered what was right. And that church moved on to become a witness and a light through the ages on the cutting edge of so many issues, where they held up and became a light. When my friend was pastoring there, the Southern Baptist so-called takeover by the more conservatives was well underway. A reporter for the Los Angeles Times Magazine had heard about a mega church in North Atlanta, and he was doing an article on the growth of mega churches. And so he came to Atlanta, and the preacher that Sunday morning served up a sentence that made him curious. Because in this sermon, the pastor said, if you want to know what's wrong with Southern Baptist, the epitome of what's wrong with them is Oakhurst Baptist in Decatur. Now, the magazine writer became curious. And so he went over and attended this church that ran a recovery program for men, a residential unit out of the top floor of the old education building, that was involved in publishing a magazine called Seeds that talked about world hunger and the need for the faithful to address it, that had so many ministries going on. And it just so happened that Sunday morning was Epiphany. And so Lanny decided he would walk off of that pronouncement by the brethren in North Atlanta. And so he thought that he would call the people to celebrate what they were being beat up for. And he preached a sermon called The Church of the Epitome. Nice creative edge to it. I thought about that because as I read the Matthew story, and I think about how religious people throughout the ages have behaved in their safe spaces, dealing with their status quo, Matthew opens up this narrative with what might be called the gospel of the epitome. He starts with these people from the east, these stargazers who experienced an epiphany. I just find the story fascinating. We walk past it every year. People are so glad in many cases that the Christmas season is behind. And I was on schedule yesterday because since Chris has been gone, it took me a lot of patience and slowly working until finally we came to Epiphany, and I put away the last Christmas decorations on the 12th day of Christmas. Epiphany gets overlooked because it can be uncomfortable. It gets overlooked because, well, we've spent all of our energy on Christmas. But it is a powerful, powerful day and a powerful witness of God's light and God's love and the inclusive Spirit of God that hovers always over what God has created. Take a look at Matthew, for instance. He doesn't give us a sentimental creche scene like Luke does. First of all, he starts out with a sermon that would bore any congregation to tears as he begins listing this incredible long history of the lineage of Jesus. And it goes on, and sometimes you wonder how many people could really beget that much. And then we get a basic story of, well, okay, Mary got pregnant, and a baby was born, and well, Joseph, who was kind of along on the side, had a dream and was told, do the right thing, take Mary. It's okay, God said so. And so there they are, and the next thing we know, there are these people in the East who are stargazers. Almost definitely, if there is any historical basis to these people, and we don't even know their names, no matter what traditionally the church has made up to make them feel better, we don't even know if there were three. We don't know. Anyway, these wise people saw a light. Probably were Zoroastrian. Zoroastrians are an eager or an interesting group of folk. And if you've ever watched the real Star Wars trilogy, not the fake moneymakers that came after the first three, have a pretty good idea of some of what Zoroastrianism is. This great cosmic battle between good and evil. They were from Persia, and they came following the light because they had curiosity and desired to know more. And they followed the light. Pagans. And they came to where Herod was. Herod consults with, his theological scholars. I find that happening all the time. Important people come to me to consult with me about my opinion. I know how burdensome that is. They tell Herod, well, there's the story back from from our scriptures that say it's going to take place. There's going to be this this messianic figure from the lineage of David born in Bethlehem of Judea. Herod gives them that word and sends them on the way and says, oh, by the way, when you find this babe, I'd really like to know. Plays the part of the good guy. Sends them on their way. Now, a colleague of mine pointed out this week, and I guess I'd never thought about this, that given their status, coming from Persia, these were basically emissaries from the ruler of Persia, which also means that emissaries from the Persian king would not have gone without a military presence. We always read about Herod's fear being only about being replaced by this newborn child. But some of the fear also may have been that there was a military contingent traveling with these emissaries. And it's true that Rome was the power of the time, and the Persians at that moment were past their prime, at least before Jesus. They still had a significant military presence, and the Roman garrison in Judea wasn't necessarily a garrison that was meant for an all-out war. So many things probably made Herod nervous. He's frightened, it says. He's frightened. Not curious, not seeking, not open to some new thing that might be happen. He's just frightened. And then there were the theologians. As Matthew reports, they weren't curious about whether a birth had happened. They weren't asking whether this had come true. These pagans from the east had come seeking this new light, and yet we get from Matthew that not one of them was curious enough to ask them where they had seen the star, what it meant to them, why they were there. Nothing. You see, for Herod and for those who were in places of power who had Herod's ear, they were interested in keeping things as they were, because the status quo is always the comfortable place to be. You remember when the people of Israel came out into the wilderness and they started complaining and says, the garlic of Egypt was better than being out here. It's always better to be back where you knew how things were than to consider what's next. Matthew is a book that is made for those of us who are willing to be dreamers and those of us who are not willing to settle for the vision of 50 years ago, but know that God is always up to something and we're curious about what it is and want to find out in such a way that we might align ourselves with God's purposes. There's dreamers in this text of Matthew. Joseph, the big one, first of all, he dreams and God says, hey, you better take Mary. The next thing you know, when Herod turns loose the troops, begins eliminating the baby boys, Joseph hears in a dream, hey, you're going to be a refugee. Head over to Egypt. Hide out over there until things cool down while Herod takes out his ruthlessness on the babies across the land. The wise people from the east, they were interested in the vision of a star that was leading them to some new place. It is a story of people who long to have a vision for the more. Not people who want to hold the status quo. The church through the ages has always been trying to find a way to consolidate its power, to keep a hold on things. And when the Spirit moves and some new movement breaks out, it's interesting how quickly people rush to quell the enthusiasm. These Persians they were something else when you think about it. To leave and take an arduous trip, and yet they were the ones who were the curious. Matthew's pointing this out to us. To any dreamers who will listen, to those who are willing to experience the movement of the Spirit, if you don't look for the light, stay diligent in seeking a vision, you'll never have vision. That's why societies, no matter where they are, no matter how they identify themselves, always need the poets, always need the artist, always need to have those who are experiencing a more expansive view of what may be possible. You know, there was a dreamer much earlier, about the centuries. He was another Joseph. As I was trying to prepare this sermon, I couldn't help but be drawn to that Joseph and an interpretation of that Joseph by Andrew Lloyd Webber. And that old musical that he wrote, old by his standards, Joseph, an Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. I always loved the one song that pops out there because Joseph, who had such a level of privilege in his family, his beautiful, beautiful coat and his hubris in the midst of his brothers, feeling as if he was something, and suddenly his brothers sell him into slavery. And the composer inserts this song. Don't need to sing it all. Probably would sing it off key anyway. But toward the end, he's pondering the light gone, the coat gone, lost. May I return to the beginning. The light is dimming, and the dream is too. The world and I, we are still waiting, still hesitating. Any dream will do. That's where we are. We find ourselves in lost spaces and we take up waiting positions. Maybe somebody else will see the light. Maybe somebody else will dream. Maybe somebody else will seek. Right now, we just need to wait, to hesitate, to see what's next in life. That's what we've been prone to do throughout the ages. Churches who found themselves in neighborhoods changed and refused to engage the neighborhood. It used to pain me to go to our churches in Baltimore. It was painful because you would go into these neighborhoods that had become predominantly African American, and what the church had proclaimed to the neighborhood was these massive steel iron, wrought iron things over their windows, bars over the doors. You see, the people in the neighborhood, they got that there was no vision left in that church. They got that a long time ago they got so caught up in surviving that they missed who and what they were called to be. For the record, I'm not picking on the Baptist here this morning, but I grew up one, and that's the bunch I know most about, except for the UCC. Early in the 1950s, the boom was on. I grew up with this as a child. This got quoted even though I was born in '51 and didn't know anything about those early days. In 1953, there was incredible growth. And you know what motto came out of that for that denomination? And it's okay because it kind of was most denominations at the time. 1 million more in 54. People had come back home from the war devastated, families devastated, people grieving, brokenness across the land, people who had fought and bled and died and suffered in the war came home to find that they still couldn't eat at most restaurants that their fellow soldiers could eat at. People were struggling in so many different ways. Women were being forced back into their place. And what could the church across the land do? Is to simply talk about numbers. 1 million more in 54 or 55 or 56. We can't forget 57. That was the biggest year for the boomers. The nation was wounded and hurting and needed attention, and there was no vision except let's add to the body count so that we will look successful. We need to ponder in the days to come here at this church. We need to give thanks. Whether you know it or not, you're in a small minority of people. Yes, you are. And that is, you're part of a mainline church in a mainline denomination that actually has had growth the last 2 years. That's astounding in itself. But that's not the vision, is it? The vision is how we act, for whom we care, where will we go, how will we minister, where is the Spirit leading, what is the dream that will take us forward past 2019, and to borrow from a movie line, to infinity and beyond. God longs to have dreamers like the wise people in Persia. God longs to have us quit hesitating and siding with the status quo. God longs for us to just open our souls and say, wow, don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I know. Closing thought. I know. I'm getting old. Sometimes we face tomorrow simply worried about getting through another day. What body ache do I have to focus on tomorrow? And I got a few of those that I have to focus on tomorrow. What am I going to do to straighten out this family that seems unable to function on its own? How am I going to control what happens on Wall Street? Life is like that. It's just hard. But if we get so focused on aches and pains and limitations, we lose the joy of life, the wanting of more, as in relationship, the more as in things that give us real joy, the more as in drinking from the well that never runs dry. I don't know about you. I don't know what this year holds. But whatever comes my way as your pastor, you got to know I want the more. I want to have my life turned upside down and inside out if God's work and vision is enhanced by doing so.